Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named The Orville, Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The drama begins 300 years in the future when human technology has rapidly advanced and a unified government has been established. One day, an astronaut, Ed, returns home after work, only to be greeted by an unexpected surprise from his wife, Kelly. He opens the bedroom door, only to find that Kelly has been cheating on him with a blue-skinned alien. Ed watches in disbelief as blue liquid sprays from the alien's head. Unable to accept this harsh reality, Ed walks away without a word. Kelly chases after him, trying to explain, but Ed doesn't want to hear it. Time flies, and a year later, Ed is summoned by the fleet commander. The commander told him that a mid-level exploration ship called the Orville is in need of a captain, and the command staff has decided that Ed is the man for the job. This is the best news Ed has received in a long time. Although he had been seen as a promising officer, Kelly's betrayal had derailed his career, and he had been underperforming for the past year. Despite this, the commander has decided to entrust Ed with this important mission. However, the Orville is still missing a helmsman and a first officer. Ed already knows who he wants for the helmsman, his longtime friend Gordon, who is an excellent pilot but has a reputation for being reckless and causing trouble. After Ed assures the commander he can keep Gordon in check, the conversation ends. Ed quickly finds his old buddy. At the time, Gordon is dressed as a samurai and locked in a duel with a massive opponent. After some back and forth, Gordon gains the upper hand. Of course, this isn't real. It's a simulation program Gordon wrote to give himself an immersive ogre fighting experience. Ed wastes no time explaining his offer. As soon as Gordon hears about the job, he snaps out of his downtime and is ready to go. Before long, Ed, now officially the new captain, delivers a speech to the crew. By this time, humanity has formed alliances with many planets, so the crew includes several aliens. After a brief speech, Ed gathers some of the senior officers for introductions. First, there's Alara, the young head of security. Because her home planet has a much higher gravitational force than others, she possesses superhuman strength on most other worlds. Then there's John, the navigator, and Bortus, the second officer. Bortus comes from a single-gender species. All members of his race are male. Lastly, Ed meets the ship's doctor and engineer. The engineer belongs to a highly advanced species that considers most other beings inferior. He's here not only for work, but also to study humans. With his eclectic crew assembled, Ed is ready to begin his journey. Soon, the Orville sets sail, and Ed's first mission is to deliver supplies to a scientific outpost. At first, everything goes smoothly, but soon Alara receives a message from the commander. A new first officer has been assigned to their ship. This should be good news, but when Ed sees the officer's profile, he loses it. The new first officer is none other than his ex-wife, Kelly. After the affair, Ed divorced her and had no intention of ever seeing her again. Now, fate has brought them back together as colleagues. Ed demands the commander reassign her, but the commander insists that Kelly is the best person for the job. With no way to overrule his superior, Ed has no choice but to accept. He returns to the bridge, anxiously waiting for Kelly's arrival. When he hears she's on board, Ed immediately asks Alara to summon her to his office. As soon as Ed leaves, the rest of the crew starts gossiping, wondering why Ed reacts so strongly to the new first officer. Gordon, who knows the whole story, happily fills them in, and the crew can't believe the drama. At the same time, Ed finally met his ex-wife, Kelly. It didn't take long for old wounds to resurface, and the two began arguing almost immediately. Ed outright demanded that Kelly leave his ship, and seeing how cold and unyielding he was, Kelly reluctantly agreed to leave when the time was right. Back on the bridge, they both pretended nothing had happened, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Fortunately, the ship had reached its destination, and the scientist at the research station initiated a video call with the Orville, informing them that he didn't actually need the supplies. Instead, he requested Ed come down for a visit. Puzzled but compliant, Ed, along with Kelly and Alara, boarded a shuttle and headed to the station. Upon their arrival, the scientist gave them a tour of the facility, proudly showing off his latest creation: redwood seeds that could grow in any environment and were also edible. He offered Ed a few to try, but Ed, after some polite small talk, quickly steered the conversation back to the reason for their visit. The scientist led them to the lab, where he revealed that a colleague had recently developed a time accelerator capable of creating a quantum field to speed up the flow of time. The scientist feared that if word got out, the Krill, one of the galaxy's most warlike species, would try to seize the accelerator and turn it into a weapon. To avoid this, he had falsely claimed to need supplies to lure the Orville into protecting the station. However, it turned out there was already a Krill spy in their midst. Sensing the situation was deteriorating, the spy immediately switched sides and contacted the Krill to come and claim the accelerator. When the scientist tried to intervene, he was shoved into the accelerator and aged to death in an instant. Meanwhile, a Krill warship arrived and dispatched 2 small craft to the station. On board the Orville, Bortus served as acting commander, ordering the ship to engage the enemy. However, being an exploration vessel, the Orville was outgunned, and their shields were quickly being depleted. In a critical moment, Gordon pulled off some incredible maneuvers, flying circles around the Krill warship to buy time. Back on the surface, the team managed to knock out the Krill spy and grabbed the accelerator, preparing to escape. Fighting their way through side corridors, they made a run for it, but there was still a squad of Krill soldiers outside. Thinking quickly, Ed ordered Alara to take the accelerator and head for the shuttle. In one swift move, Alara sprinted ahead and made it back to the shuttle, while the rest of the team had to run through a hail of bullets. Luckily, the Krill soldiers had terrible aim, and the group made it back to the shuttle unharmed. But to their surprise, a Krill soldier had stowed away on board. In a moment of desperation, Ed slammed on the brakes, knocking the stowaway unconscious. However, the Orville had taken severe damage, and the shuttle had been hit by debris, making it difficult to control. In the nick of time, Gordon pulled off another round of amazing flying, bringing the shuttle safely back to the Orville, and Ed and his team returned to the bridge. With the situation critical, Ed attempted to negotiate with the Krill captain, but the captain demanded the accelerator in exchange for sparing the ship. Faced with an ultimatum, Kelly came up with a plan. She asked the scientist to set the accelerator to 100 years, and then had Ed place one of the redwood seeds on it. When the Krill took possession of the accelerator, Ed triggered it remotely. Instantly, the seeds sprouted and grew into a massive tree, tearing the Krill ship apart. With the crisis averted, Kelly informed Ed that she would be leaving, as a replacement had already been arranged to take her position as first officer. However, after some thought, Ed asked her to stay and help him, and she agreed, leaving the door open for reconciliation. What Ed didn't know was that Kelly had been advocating for him behind the scenes, convincing the commander to make him captain of the Orville. It helped that Kelly's father was well connected with the commander, which sealed the deal for Ed's promotion. Not long after, Bortus approached Ed with an unusual request for leave. He had laid an egg, as his species reproduced by laying eggs. Ed, having no reason to refuse, granted him the time off. Before long, the Orville received a distress signal from a transport ship claiming to have been attacked by the Krill. Ed immediately ordered the ship to set course, and soon made contact with the transport's captain. To his surprise, Ed's parents were on board the transport. After some pleasantries, Ed decided to take Kelly along in a shuttle to visit them. Since Bortus was still incubating his egg, Alara, by rank, became the acting commander. What Ed thought would be a routine family visit turned into a nightmare when he and Kelly vanished as soon as they arrived on the transport, which then disappeared right before everyone's eyes. Faced with this sudden crisis, Alara, commanding for the first time, was at a complete loss. She rushed to Bortus for help, but he refused, insisting that she step up and take responsibility. After some thought, Alara decided to gather her courage and poured herself a drink to steady her nerves. Returning to the bridge, she ordered an attempt to pull the shuttle back using the ship's tractor beam, but the engineer opposed the idea, warning it was too reckless. Alara stuck to her decision, and unfortunately, the engineer's fears came true. The shuttle exploded mid-retrieval, causing damage to the Orville and injuring crew members. Shaken by the outcome, Alara doubted her ability to lead and asked the doctor to relieve her of command, but the doctor refused, encouraging her to learn from the mistake and focus on rescuing Ed and Kelly. After a heartfelt pep talk, Alara regained her confidence and prepared to take charge again. Meanwhile, Ed and Kelly found themselves trapped in what appeared to be their old New York apartment, but the doors were locked, and they were effectively imprisoned. With no way to escape, they made the best of their situation, using the food replicator to prepare meals and changing into casual clothes. In a strange way, it felt more like a vacation than captivity. Back on the Orville, the reason for their disappearance began to surface. Through investigation, Alara discovered that Ed and Kelly had been transported to Calivan, a planet inhabited by a technologically superior species that viewed other races as inferior. The fleet's leadership was unwilling to risk the Orville by entering Calivan space, and they were prepared to write Ed and Kelly off as casualties. Alara, following orders, was forced to prepare to issue the grim announcement, but the crew was outraged, and Alara quickly became the target of their frustration. Unsure of what to do, she was reminded by Gordon that if she had been the one taken, Ed would have stopped at nothing to rescue her. This woke her up to the reality of the situation, and Alara immediately ordered a course to Calivan to rescue Ed and Kelly, reigniting the crew's morale. When Ed woke up, he and Kelly realized they were being watched by Calavans and other alien species. After some conversation with fellow captives, they discovered that they had been imprisoned in a Calivan Zoo. The Calavans considered other species too primitive and used holographic bait to capture them for display in their zoo, even abducting children. Once imprisoned, there was virtually no escape. Luckily, the Orville was nearing Calivan's space, and with some clever work from the engineer, the ship disguised itself as a Calivan vessel and slipped through unnoticed. Because the engineer's homeworld was also highly advanced, the Calavans considered his species an equal. He used this to their advantage, planning to negotiate for Ed and Kelly's release. Alara and the engineer soon found the zoo's administrator, and the Calavans, true to form, treated the advanced species with respect. The engineer lied, claiming that Ed and Kelly had contracted a rare and dangerous disease, and he needed to take them away. However, instead of complying, the administrator decided to euthanize the pair to deal with the problem. Alara tried to intervene, but the administrator refused to speak to anyone he considered a lesser being. After some persistent convincing by the engineer, the administrator finally agreed to listen. Alara offered a valuable new exhibit in exchange for Ed and Kelly, which caught the administrator's interest, allowing Ed and Kelly to escape death. Once back on the Orville, Ed awarded Alara a commendation for her bravery and leadership, and the crew threw a party to celebrate. It turns out, the new exhibit Alara had promised the Calavans was none other than a collection of Earth's ancient cultural archives, reality TV shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians. The exhibit drew large crowds of Calavans who were captivated by the over-the-top drama. Just when things seemed to end on a high note, Bortus received shocking news. His egg had successfully hatched, but to his and his partner's surprise, the hatchling was a girl. However, Bortus's species, the Moklan, are a single-gender race where all individuals are male. The rest of the crew, unaware of the gravity of the situation, congratulated Bortus on his new baby. In reality, this was not an isolated incident. Every 75 years, a female is born among the Moklan. Bortus and his partner had already decided to take the necessary steps to correct the situation. Meanwhile, the ship's doctor was performing a routine checkup on Yafit, a gelatinous crew member. Yafit wasn't actually sick, he just wanted an excuse to ask the doctor out on a date. The doctor firmly rejected his cross-species advances and sent him on his way. At that moment, Bortus approached the doctor with a straightforward request. He wanted the doctor to perform a gender reassignment surgery on the child, as per Moklan tradition. The doctor flatly refused, staying true to her ethical principles. Elsewhere, Ed, Gordon, and John were enjoying themselves in a virtual reality program. What was supposed to be an old-fashioned cowboy shootout had been turned into a dance battle by Gordon, leaving Ed and John both baffled. Bortus interrupted their fun, repeating his request, this time asking Ed to order the doctor to perform the surgery. However, as a human, Ed couldn't condone the idea of forcing a gender reassignment on an infant, especially since it violated union law. Frustrated, Bortus left in disappointment. Not long after, the crew continued their duties while discussing the issue of the surgery. Unsurprisingly, the humans and aliens aboard the Orville had differing opinions. Soon, Ed received a call from the Moklan Minister of Internal Affairs, informing him that a Moklan warship was en route to meet the Orville. It turned out that Bortus had called for reinforcements, hoping that his homeworld would intervene and take the child away. This enraged Ed, who reprimanded Bortus for making unilateral decisions and temporarily relieved him of duty to prevent further complications. However, as Ed reflected on the situation, he became conflicted. He realized this was a deeply rooted cultural issue, and he couldn't simply impose human moral standards onto an alien race. But with Kelly's encouragement, Ed regained his resolve and devised a plan. Since the Moklan viewed females as inherently weak, Ed decided to show them that women could be strong too. He asked Alara, who was incredibly strong due to her species' high-gravity homeworld, to challenge Bortus in a fight. Alara easily overpowered Bortus, but the display did nothing to change his mind. Realizing that force wouldn't work, Ed switched tactics. He sent Gordon and John to bond with Bortus over drinks and a Daniel Cece movie. They watched Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, in which Rudolph, despite his defective red nose, was chosen to lead Santa's sleigh. The story resonated with Bortus, who had an epiphany. What society saw as a flaw could actually be a strength. Motivated by this realization, Bortus approached his partner, hoping to convince him to reconsider the surgery. To Bortus's surprise, his partner refused and revealed a secret from his past. He had also been born female and underwent corrective surgery as an infant. His partner wasn't trying to hide this, but the procedure had been done so early that he had lived his entire life as a male Moklan. It wasn't until he joined the Orville that the ship's doctor discovered his history. The revelation led to a heated argument between the two. As this drama unfolded, the Moklan warship arrived. Despite the couple's disagreement, the Moklan captain insisted on following tradition and prepared to take the baby by force. In a last-ditch effort, Bortus proposed taking the matter to court. Since no Moklan lawyer would touch the case, Bortus asked Ed and Kelly to represent him. Kelly, who had only studied law for a year, reluctantly agreed for the sake of the child. The crew soon found themselves on Moklan's home planet, where they discovered the surface was entirely industrialized, with the primary industry being weapons manufacturing. The Moklans had even set aside dedicated areas to test explosives, and the crew had a near miss as they passed through one of these zones, narrowly avoiding a blast. Shortly after, the court session began. The Moklan lawyer spoke first, arguing that if the child didn't undergo the gender reassignment surgery, she would be an outcast, shunned by Moklan society. Kelly took her usual approach, having Alara demonstrate her immense strength to prove that women could be just as powerful. However, the judge wasn't easily swayed, pointing out that Alara's strength was due to the natural abilities of her species, and that the male members of her race were even stronger. Fortunately, Kelly had another strategy up her sleeve. She asked Gordon several intelligence test questions, which he answered completely wrong. Kelly's goal was to show that men, too, could be unintelligent. However, this tactic had no effect. As the Moklan lawyer continued to press his case, Ed realized that they were losing ground. Thinking quickly, he devised a plan to turn the situation around. Soon after, Ed, Kelly, and Bortus went searching through a cave and eventually found a female Moklan. They brought her to the court, causing quite a stir. The woman shared her story. Years ago, her parents had refused to subject her to the surgery and instead raised her in secret, educating her in isolation within the caves. She had intended to live her entire life in hiding, but upon hearing about the trial, she decided to come forward and speak out. She even quoted a famous Moklan author to support her argument. The lawyer quickly accused the woman of disrespecting the legacy of this beloved writer. In a shocking twist, the woman revealed that the famous author's name was actually her own pen name. The courtroom was stunned, unable to believe that the most revered author in Moklan history was a woman. With that revelation, the debate became meaningless. The judge announced that the matter would be sent to an arbitration committee for a final decision. After a long wait, the verdict was a disappointment to the crew. The committee found no sufficient grounds to stop the surgery, and the court officially ruled in favor of proceeding with the operation. The crew's efforts had ultimately failed, and Bortus stood motionless, devastated by the outcome. Not long after, the Moklan doctor performed the gender reassignment surgery, and Bortus and his partner returned to the Orville with their child. Despite the painful experience, the couple's love for their child remained unchanged. Regardless of gender, they vowed to take care of their child to the best of their ability. After the matter was resolved, Bortus's partner expressed a desire for some intimacy, but Bortus was completely focused on work and showed no interest in family matters. He reminded his partner that by joining him on the ship, he should have expected the demands of Bortus's job. Hurt by Bortus's words, his partner decided to entertain himself while Bortus returned to work. Meanwhile, the crew of the Orville discovered a massive artificial structure nearby and set off to investigate. Though they were prepared for something unusual, the sight that greeted them still left everyone in awe. It's a colossal interstellar warship. The engineer quickly determined that the ship was over 2,000 years old and that its engines had long since shut down, leaving it drifting on momentum alone. Unfortunately, its current trajectory would lead it to collide with a star in 6 months. Concerned that there might still be living beings aboard, Ed led the team on a mission to investigate and warn them. After passing through several heavy doors, they were astonished to find an entire world inside the ship. It turned out to be an enormous biosphere, complete with its own ecosystems and civilization. Comparing it to their own ship, Ed couldn't help but think that the Orville looked like a rust bucket in comparison. The team split up to gather more information. Ed's group encountered some of the native inhabitants, but they were greeted with gunfire. The engineer was forced to stun the attackers. Afterward, Ed quickly tried to explain their intentions, but communication revealed that the locals had no idea they were inside a spaceship. Fortunately, a local was willing to help them. Through him, Ed and his team learned that the inhabitants believed their world had been created by a god named Doral. As with many theocratic societies, there were dissenters, and the local happened to be one of them. He led the crew to a camp of rebels who opposed the dominant religious beliefs. In a conversation with the leader of the dissenters, Ed learned that the city was ruled by a dictator who had established all the laws. The dictator forbade any questioning of the belief in Doral as the creator and banned any notion that other worlds existed. The dissenters were labeled heretics and were forced to live in remote, isolated areas. Before Ed could finish his conversation, he received a distress signal from Alara, learning that Kelly and Alara were in trouble. Earlier, the two had been chatting as they walked, discussing their personal lives, when suddenly a car screeched to a halt beside them. Two armed soldiers demanded their IDs. Alara tried to approach and explain, but she was shot and rolled down a hill, while Kelly was knocked unconscious and taken away. Upon hearing this, Ed immediately gathered the crew to mount a rescue mission, while Kelly was brought into the city. At the same time, the dictator was riling up the crowd, urging them to pass judgment on a dissenter. Under his incitement, the mob swarmed the dissenter, brutally beating him to death. Kelly was furious. She was then taken to meet the dictator. The dictator, of course, didn't believe that the ship was on a collision course with a star, and he began interrogating Kelly, demanding to know the whereabouts of her companions. Meanwhile, Ed and his team found Alara, and the doctor quickly treated her wounds. The locals speculated that Kelly had likely been taken to the dictator. Since their communicators couldn't transmit through the ship's structure to signal the Orville, Ed sent the engineer back to the ship to call for reinforcements. However, the Orville had just received a distress call from a transport ship under attack by the Krill, and since there were likely children on board, Bortus ordered the ship to respond, leaving only a communication beacon behind. Despite having no backup, Ed decided to press on and infiltrate the dictator's stronghold. Using a bit of trickery, they knocked out the guards and rushed in to rescue Kelly. At the same time, the dictator ordered his men to inject Kelly with a nerve agent to force her to talk. Fortunately, Ed's team arrived in time, and under Alara's intimidating force, the dictator quickly handed over the antidote. Ed attempted to reason with the dictator and explain the truth, but the dictator refused to believe it. With no other option, Ed knocked him out. With the help of the dissenters, the crew reached a long-forgotten hatch. The engineer managed to open the ancient doors, and by pure luck, they found themselves on the ship's bridge. The engineer soon discovered a video recording that revealed the secret of this world. It turned out that Doral was actually the captain of this massive starship. His people, from a distant world, had built the ship to explore the galaxy. Due to the length of the journey, the ship was designed with an onboard ecosystem to support 3 generations of inhabitants before they reached their destination. Unfortunately, the ship had encountered an ion storm that damaged its engines, leaving it adrift in space, waiting for rescue. Over time, the ship's inhabitants had forgotten their origins, living out their lives within the ship's closed environment. The engineer identified the engine malfunction and was ready to start repairs. He also discovered that part of the ship's ceiling could be opened. Upon hearing this, Ed ordered the ceiling to be unsealed. For the first time in 2,000 years, the people on the ship could look up and see the vastness of the stars, realizing they were not alone in the universe. Ed decided to contact the Union fleet, requesting a special task force to come and help the inhabitants learn how to operate their ship again. Afterward, they would regain control of their species' future. One day, the human crew members were enjoying some TV shows during their downtime, laughing hysterically, except for the engineer, who couldn't understand the humor. Wanting to help him get a better grasp of human culture, Gordon promised to pull a prank on the engineer at some point. At that moment, the Orville received a routine distress signal, this time from a mining ship that had crash-landed on a comet. The comet was being pulled toward a star by its gravity, and the mining ship's captain, Priya, sent a video message pleading for help. Ed took Gordon and Alara on a shuttle to rescue her. Initially, everything went smoothly, and Priya was successfully rescued. But soon after, the shuttle was caught by the star's gravitational pull, threatening to drag it into the star. Acting quickly, John activated the tractor beam, barely managing to pull the shuttle back to the Orville. With the crisis averted, Priya was rushed to the medical bay. She explained that while mining, her ship had encountered a Krill warship, and during her escape, she ran out of fuel. Detecting fuel on the comet, she had attempted to land and refuel, but that's when things went wrong. Ed didn't find her story suspicious and offered Priya a place to stay, even inviting her to join the evening's cocktail party. Later, as Ed was about to leave work to prepare for the party, Gordon stopped him, asking him to wait a moment. It turned out that Gordon had pranked the engineer while he was recharging, dressing him up humorously. Since the engineer relied on internal sensors to perceive his surroundings, he hadn't noticed. It wasn't until the crew pointed it out that the engineer realized he had been tricked. To help the engineer appreciate the fun of pranks, Gordon suggested he try pulling a prank himself. After some playful antics, the crew gathered for the cocktail party, with Priya naturally becoming the center of attention. During their conversation, Ed discovered that Priya was from his hometown, sparking an instant connection. As they continued chatting, Kelly began to feel a pang of jealousy. After the party, Priya went to Ed's quarters to thank him for saving her life and for his hospitality. Before leaving, she kissed him, hinting at a growing romance between them. Meanwhile, Kelly's suspicions grew. Something didn't seem right to her, so she checked the mining company's employee records and found that there was no one named Priya listed. Alarmed, she grew suspicious of Priya's true intentions. At that time, Ed was giving Priya a tour of the control room, chatting happily with John and Yafit. Kelly rushed over to tell Ed what she had discovered, but Ed dismissed her concerns, explaining that mining companies often had high employee turnover and their records could be inaccurate. Unwilling to let it go, Kelly turned to Alara, the head of security, and privately asked her to help search Priya's room. Alara was hesitant, as they had no legitimate reason to conduct a search, but Kelly insisted, and Alara reluctantly agreed to help her look around. After some rummaging, Alara discovered a strange square metal object hidden under Priya's bed. Kelly's scanner couldn't identify it, raising more questions. Unfortunately, Priya returned just then, and Alara and Kelly had to quickly cover, claiming they were conducting a radiation check. Their excuse was enough to keep Priya from becoming suspicious, at least for the moment. The two immediately reported their findings to Ed, but he was furious. He reprimanded them for entering someone's room without permission and even issued Alara a formal reprimand. Kelly, still undeterred, accused Ed of showing favoritism toward Priya because of his personal feelings. This only escalated the situation, leading to a heated argument between Ed and Kelly. They hadn't finished their argument when the Orville was suddenly struck by an impact, prompting Ed and Kelly to rush back to the bridge. The engineer reported that the ship had encountered an extremely rare dark matter storm. Priya claimed to have survived a dark matter storm before and offered a suggestion that even the engineer hadn't heard of. The engineer decided to give it a try, and sure enough, Priya's method revealed the dark matter to everyone. Ed quickly ordered Gordon to steer them out of the area, but having never encountered dark matter before, Gordon struggled to navigate. As the ship faced imminent danger, Priya offered to take the helm. With no other choice, Ed agreed. Priya expertly maneuvered the ship, avoiding the dark matter, leaving the rest of the crew in awe. After narrowly escaping, the Orville found its communication systems completely down. Ed planned to make a long detour to the nearest outpost for repairs, but Priya suggested a closer mining base, where she had friends who could assist the crew. After the harrowing experience, Ed didn't suspect Priya of any ulterior motives, and despite Kelly's objections, agreed to her suggestion. Later, Ed took Priya to the ship's simulation room. As they enjoyed the virtual scenery and discussed life, one thing led to another, and they ended up tongue-massaging each other, eventually taking things a step further. During a reflective moment afterward, Ed even opened up to Priya about his past, including how he had been cheated on by his ex-wife. While Ed was caught up in his new romance, Gordon was having a much worse day. When he woke up, he discovered that one of his legs was missing. Furious, he stormed to the bridge to confront the engineer. It turned out that the engineer had amputated Gordon's leg while he was asleep and hidden it as part of what he considered a clever prank. Hearing this explanation only made Gordon angrier. The crew had to restrain him and take him to the medical bay for leg regeneration surgery. Before Ed had a chance to deal with the engineer's behavior, the chief of the control room summoned him and Kelly. Yafit had discovered the square metal object from Priya's room lodged in the ship's navigation ducts. Ed had no choice but to confront Priya. Realizing she had been exposed, Priya didn't bother to hide the truth any longer. She revealed that she was from the 29th century, 400 years in the future. Initially, Ed didn't believe her bullshit, but Priya demonstrated the power of the square metal object by taking control of the Orville's flight systems, explaining that it was how she had escaped the dark matter storm. Kelly, still skeptical, asked why someone from the future would go out of their way to save the crew. Priya then revealed her true motive. She was an antique dealer who worked for private collectors. Her job was to travel to specific points in the past, prevent certain disasters, and then bring the ships back to the future to sell them. As for the crew, they would be forced to live in the 29th century. Before the conversation could continue, Gordon's amputated leg suddenly fell from its hiding place, creating a moment of awkward silence. But it didn't disrupt the conversation for long. Priya continued explaining that in the 29th century, humans had discovered a wormhole that allowed for time travel. Her plan was to take the Orville through this wormhole, which was why she had disabled the ship's communications. At this point, Ed realized he had no choice. Despite their personal connection, he had to protect his crew. He decided to remove the square metal object. However, during the attempt, the engineer was injured and knocked unconscious. Desperate to stop Priya's plan, Ed called in Gordon, who was still recovering from his leg surgery. Priya, determined to complete her mission, teleported into the control room to secure her objective. Ed tried to reason with her, but Priya explained that if she allowed the crew to return to their time, she would be exposed for altering the timeline. By now, the Orville had passed through the wormhole and arrived in the future, facing Priya's awaiting ship. At that moment, the engineer regained consciousness and sent a message to the crew, announcing that he had regained control of the ship. Ed ordered Gordon to get them out of there, while Kelly engaged in a fight with Priya. The alien ship, realizing its cargo was escaping, fired a tractor beam. But the Orville managed to power through, heading back toward the wormhole and narrowly avoiding capture. Once safe, Ed ordered Alara to bring Priya to his office. Priya warned him that the timeline had already been altered and that the future was now uncertain. However, Ed had already made up his mind. He decided to destroy the wormhole, ensuring that the Orville could continue its journey without interference, even though it meant Priya would never return. Priya couldn't believe that Ed would go through with it, but he ultimately gave the order, and they watched as she disappeared before their eyes. Fate had brought them together for only a brief moment. A few days later, while the crew was having a meal, they learned that Bortus's species has an exceptionally strong digestive system, capable of eating almost anything. Naturally, this piqued everyone's curiosity, and they started handing him all sorts of bizarre items to eat for fun. In the middle of the amusement, an emergency alert interrupted them. Another distress signal had come through. It was the Krill again, attacking a colony. To protect the planet, Ed hailed the Krill warship. The move worked instantly, but not in the way he hoped. The Krill redirected their attack toward the Orville instead. In terms of firepower, the Orville was no match for the Krill, but Ed chose to outsmart them, using clever tactics to successfully destroy the Krill warship. Interestingly, this time the Krill escape pod remained intact, which was a significant win for the Union. The Union leadership quickly devised a bold plan. Despite multiple clashes with the Krill, little was known about them. The Union knew only that the Krill were deeply religious, and their belief system justified their superiority over other species, which led them to attack other planets. To gain a deeper understanding of their religion, Ed and Gordon were assigned a covert mission to infiltrate the Krill. Before they could depart, a Krill soldier suddenly held Ed hostage, demanding that Bortus eat his weapon, leaving everyone confused, until it was revealed that the whole scenario was a test run of the engineer's newly developed holographic disguiser. This device would allow Ed and Gordon to impersonate Krill. During their journey, Ed read through the intelligence reports and discovered that the Krill homeworld was in perpetual darkness, earning them a reputation as space vampires. Before they could finish their discussion, the Krill ship arrived. Fortunately, their disguises worked flawlessly, and the Krill didn't suspect a thing. Ed and Gordon claimed that their ship had been destroyed by the Orville and that they were the only survivors, earning them temporary trust. It just so happened that it was time for the Krill to observe their religious ceremony. All work stopped as the crew headed to the chapel for worship. Ed and Gordon followed suit, and while there, they struck up a conversation with a Krill woman. Coincidentally, her brother had served on the Krill ship that the Orville destroyed. Ed and Gordon played along, claiming to have been close to her brother, which helped them gain her trust. Soon after, the bishop announced the start of the purification ritual. He proceeded to crush the head of a captured human, offering it as a sacrifice to the Krill god. The brutal sight left Ed and Gordon horrified. After the ceremony, they sneaked back into the chapel to scan the massive Krill Bible. However, the bishop returned unexpectedly, catching them off guard. The two hastily claimed they were seeking deeper guidance from the Krill god and quickly left. The bishop, suspicious of their behavior, immediately reported the incident to the captain and requested that a guard be stationed at the chapel. Meanwhile, Ed and Gordon returned to the chapel to continue scanning. Unfortunately, their device malfunctioned, causing their disguises to drop. Worse still, the guard arrived just in time to see them. Luckily for the two, the guard's poor eyesight worked in their favor, allowing them to escape. Back in their quarters, Ed began investigating the source of the signal interference, only to discover that it was caused by a newly developed Krill bomb. Realizing the gravity of the situation, they approached the Krill woman for information and learned that the Krill planned to test the bomb on a defenseless human colony. The two immediately recognized the dire threat. With the Union fleet too far away to intervene, they had to find a way to destroy the bomb themselves. As if things weren't complicated enough, the Krill woman invited them to give a talk to her students. To their shock, they discovered that the warship had a group of children on board. This made their task even more difficult, as they needed to protect both the Krill children and the human colony. Scrambling for a solution, Ed and Gordon made an excuse to leave. Now they faced the challenge of stopping the bomb without harming anyone. Just then, a young boy approached, asking them questions about humans, which they patiently answered as they weighed their options. After searching everywhere to no avail, the little boy's questions sparked an idea in Ed. He suddenly realized that the Krill, who had never seen sunlight, must fear light. He and Gordon quickly sent the boy away and decided to amplify the UV rays in the ship's lighting system to kill the Krill. However, they had to make sure that the lights in the classroom remained off. After finalizing their plan, they set it in motion. Initially, everything went smoothly, but while Gordon was communicating with Ed, the bishop caught him, and his disguise malfunctioned, revealing his true identity. The bishop immediately ordered the alarm to be sounded. At the same time, Ed noticed the schoolboy who had been asking questions had slipped away. As the alarm blared, Ed quickly smashed the classroom lights and instructed the Krill woman to keep the children safe before rushing into action. Meanwhile, Gordon was taken for interrogation, and the Krill decided to launch the bomb. Luckily, Ed managed to return the boy to the classroom just as the lights were activated. The blinding light incinerated the Krill outside, while Gordon pulled off some skillful maneuvers and successfully deactivated the bomb. Afterward, Ed apologized to the Krill woman, explaining that he acted out of necessity to preserve peace. The Krill woman, however, warned him that while he may have saved the children, those children would one day grow up to become his enemies. The scene shifts to the crew of the Orville arriving at Sargas 4, a planet that not only looked remarkably similar to Earth, but also had technology and culture resembling 21st century Earth. The Union had previously sent scientists to study the planet, but they had mysteriously disappeared. Kelly led a team to the surface to investigate. To blend in with the locals, the team had to wear native clothing, and Alara had to cover her forehead and ears with a hat. Since Sargas 4 was a capitalist society, Ed handed out cash to the team and reminded them to complete the mission quickly. However, the crew was unaware that this planet had a rating system where everyone could rate each other's behavior with positive or negative votes, and these ratings directly impacted a person's social standing. Oblivious to this, the team approached a newsstand vendor to ask about the missing scientists. The vendor cryptically mentioned that the scientists often frequented a nearby cafe and pointed out that the crew needed rating badges. When they learned that they could be arrested for not having one, they reluctantly purchased badges with their cash. On the way, the team chatted about Alara's ex-boyfriend, with Alara mentioning his strange dance moves. In a moment of impulsiveness, John grabbed a nearby statue and started mimicking the dance moves, drawing attention from passers-by who began recording him. Kelly quickly stopped him and led the team to the cafe. There, Kelly asked a waitress about the scientists. However, the waitress seemed to take a liking to John, and Kelly, worried that he might cause more trouble, quickly shifted the conversation by showing her photos of the scientists. The waitress revealed that the two scientists had been corrected a month ago, leaving the crew puzzled. At that moment, John's badge began receiving a flood of negative votes. His earlier antics had been uploaded online, and the statue he danced on turned out to be of a revered local figure. Seeing the bad ratings, the waitress kicked John out, but once he was outside, a crowd quickly surrounded him. Kelly reported the situation to Ed, intending to get John out of there, but it was too late. The police arrived and arrested him. With no other option, Ed contacted union leadership, requesting permission to reveal their alien identity to resolve the situation. However, the higher-ups rejected the request, fearing it would disrupt the planet's historical development and have unpredictable consequences. Ed was ordered to resolve the issue using local methods. Meanwhile, John was assigned a lawyer by the local authorities. The lawyer explained that with over 1 million negative votes, John would now have to go on an apology tour or else face correction, which involved a neural procedure that erased negative thoughts from the brain. Terrified, John discussed the situation with the crew. The doctor pointed out that the planet's technology wasn't advanced enough, meaning the correction procedure could cause permanent brain damage. Alara suggested they find the scientists who had already undergone correction to understand what they were dealing with. The team split into 2 groups, with Kelly accompanying John on his apology tour. The tour required John to go on live television, express remorse, and let the public vote on whether to forgive him. The absurdity of the system left the crew baffled. John struggled to adapt, and after a fiery exchange, his negative votes only increased. Still, there was a chance to turn things around. Meanwhile, Alara and the doctor sought the waitress's help. During their conversation, a man wearing a hat approached, claiming that Alara was disrespecting his culture by wearing a hat, which was sacred to his people. He gave Alara a negative vote, drawing a crowd. Despite her attempts to explain, the man refused to listen, accusing her of insulting his heritage. The doctor, fearing things would escalate, pulled Alara away and took her to the bathroom to swap the hat for a scarf. The waitress happened to walk in and was startled by Alara's true appearance. Alara and the doctor quickly stopped her, and to gain her trust, they revealed their true identities. The doctor wasted no time and asked about the scientists' offenses. The truth was even more shocking than expected. The scientists had been discussing work on a bus and failed to notice a pregnant woman standing behind them. When a photo of the incident was posted online, it caused an uproar. Without considering the facts, the public assumed the scientists had refused to give up their seats for the woman, and they were flooded with negative votes. Both were taken for correction. One scientist tried to escape and was killed on the spot, while the other complied and underwent the neural procedure. With the waitress's help, the doctor and Alara found the surviving scientist and brought him back to the ship. After a thorough examination, the doctor discovered that a portion of the scientist's frontal lobe had been removed, rendering him beyond help. Meanwhile, John was still struggling to avoid punishment, but despite several attempts, he kept failing. In fairness, it wasn't entirely his fault. The public didn't even bother listening to his apologies and simply voted based on their moods. The lawyer informed Kelly that after John's apology tour, his negative votes had to stay below 10 million for him to avoid correction. However, John had already accumulated over 9 million downvotes. Facing this dire situation, Ed came up with a plan to exploit a loophole in the rules. Since no one from outside the planet was allowed in, they decided to bring the waitress aboard instead. She became the first native of the planet to go into space, and Ed treated her with respect, asking her about the local system. She explained that her people believed everyone had a voice, and thus everything was decided by voting. Each person received a rating badge upon reaching adulthood, which was used to determine good and bad behavior. Most of the population relied on an app called Mainstream, which heavily influenced their votes. By now, John had been taken to the execution chamber, and the final voting round was about to begin. The waitress quickly offered advice, and the engineer hacked into Mainstream, inserting favorable information. Soon, stories about John supporting his 90-year-old grandmother, being overweight as a child, and reuniting with his dog as a war veteran began circulating. The engineer even synthesized photos and videos to make the stories more convincing. With the combined efforts of the team, John's votes stayed under 10 million, and he was spared the correction. After everything had settled, the waitress returned to her home planet, now more cautious about carelessly giving negative votes. Once again, the crew had narrowly escaped a crisis. Following the ordeal, the doctor decided to take a vacation with her 2 sons. She originally planned for John to pilot the shuttle, but he was tied up with work. Kelly assigned the engineer as a substitute, which gave him an opportunity to observe human family dynamics. However, as soon as they boarded the shuttle, the 2 children began to squabble, much to the doctor's frustration. Out of curiosity, the engineer asked about the doctor's spouse, but she explained that she didn't have a husband, having had the children through artificial insemination. When the engineer started giving parenting advice, the doctor grew irritated, and soon both the children and the adults were bickering. Suddenly, the shuttle encountered a problem. While the engineer was adjusting the flight path, the kids accidentally threw a gaming console at the control panel, causing the shuttle to lose control. It was pulled into a gravitational field and dragged to an unknown region. The ship was severely damaged, and the engineer was forced to find an oxygen-rich planet for an emergency landing. He instructed the doctor to go to the engineering room to activate the emergency power. The doctor managed to complete the task, but couldn't return to her seat in time. The shuttle crashed into a mountain, splitting the ship in half, with the rear section, where the doctor was, plummeting to the ground. The unconscious doctor was dragged away by a mysterious figure, while the engineer and the children barely landed safely on flat ground. After some time, the engineer calculated the shuttle's crash location. Since his system categorized the children as burdens, he gave them a gun for protection and set off alone to find the doctor. He soon arrived at the crash site, but the doctor was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, the children were left trembling in fear inside the shuttle. When the doctor's older son needed to use the bathroom, the younger son accompanied him with the gun. Suddenly, they heard a noise outside which scared them both. In the confusion, the older son was captured by the natives. Just as things seemed dire, the engineer returned in time, shooting the native and rescuing the boy. With the immediate danger over, the engineer began working on repairing the shuttle. He discovered that the Dyson particles powering the ship had been depleted and could not be replenished for the time being. The doctor's younger son, recalling what he had learned, suggested that the mountain they had crashed into might contain the particles. The engineer scanned the shuttle's exterior and confirmed that traces of particles were present, indicating that the mountain held an abundant supply. However, as night had fallen, the engineer decided to wait until morning to search. Meanwhile, the doctor's disappearance had been noticed by the crew of the Orville. Ed immediately ordered the ship to set out in search of her. The next day, the engineer set off with the two children, who continued to argue over the gaming console. Growing tired of their bickering, the engineer ended the dispute once and for all by shooting the game console, destroying it. As they made their way forward, a group of natives appeared, ready to fight. The engineer quickly incapacitated them with several stun shots. Observing them closely, he noticed that the natives seemed malnourished and afflicted by some strange disease. To reach the mountain faster, the trio had to wade through a river, during which the doctor's son slipped and fell, but fortunately, he wasn't harmed. They continued their journey, but night fell before they could reach their destination, so they were forced to camp. To help the kids fall asleep, the engineer, using the doctor's voice, told them bedtime stories. Meanwhile, the doctor awoke to find herself locked in a dark room. She banged on the door, calling for help. Before long, a disfigured man entered, bringing her food. The doctor asked to be let out so she could find her children, but the man insisted she stay in the safety of the room, then left. Determined not to give up, the doctor began searching for an escape, even inspecting the metal panels on the walls. The man returned later and slowly shared the planet's tragic history. Long ago, a group of natives, desperate to win a war, poisoned the water supply with a biological weapon, killing thousands and leaving survivors disfigured and diseased. Food had become scarce, and some of the natives had resorted to cannibalism. Foreseeing this crisis, the man had stockpiled food, clean water, and most importantly, weapons. He knew how dangerous it was outside and refused to let the doctor leave, but she remained determined to find her children and continued trying to pry open the metal panels. After much effort, the doctor finally succeeded in opening a panel. To escape, she devised a plan, pretending she had injured herself and begging the man to return to the shuttle for antibiotics. After much persuasion, the man fell for the ruse. Once he left, the doctor escaped through the panel and into an adjacent room. Fortunately, the man hadn't discarded her communicator, and she quickly re-established contact with the engineer. At the same time, the doctor's older son had fallen ill after being exposed to the river water. The doctor comforted him, and the younger son took the opportunity to apologize for his earlier behavior. After an emotional moment with her children, the doctor pressed on. She armed herself with a knife and waited for the man to return. When he did, she attacked him without hesitation. During the struggle, she managed to grab his gun and shot him dead like a piece of soap. She then hurried toward the engineer's location, killing a native along the way and extracting some of his blood for analysis, unaware that a large group of natives was tracking her. Before long, the doctor reunited with the engineer. Using the collected particles, the engineer restored power to the shuttle, but the particle purity was too low to send more than a short distress signal. While the doctor had successfully collected a blood sample, she needed the Orville's lab to develop a cure. Luckily, the crew received the signal, and Ed ordered Gordon to take a shuttle down to provide backup. By this point, a large group of natives had surrounded them, and the engineer was quickly overwhelmed. In a critical moment, the younger son bravely stood alongside the engineer to help defend against the attackers, just as Gordon arrived and helped fend them off. Sometime later, the doctor successfully created a cure and treated her son. The Union also planned to send a medical team to help the native population. However, the doctor had one more important task to complete. She sought out the engineer to thank him properly. Through his experiences with the children, the engineer had gained a deeper understanding of the bonds of human family and affection. The scene shifts to the crew deciding to have a karaoke session during their downtime. After Kelly's brilliant performance, Bortus surprised everyone by stepping up to sing. The crew exchanged worried glances, already bracing themselves for the inevitable disaster of his voice. However, just as Bortus took a deep breath and was about to start, the Orville received an urgent message. This time it was a directive from the fleet commander. 2 races on the planet Los had been locked in a bitter, long-standing conflict over the planet's sovereignty. Recently, an ancient artifact had been discovered on Los, and both sides agreed to have the Union's archaeologist conduct a genetic analysis. If the genes on the artifact matched one race, that race would be granted control of Los. The Orville was tasked with overseeing the situation, with both delegations arriving on board to await the results, and the archaeologist would carry out the testing on the ship. Recognizing the importance of this diplomatic mission, Ed quickly began preparations. Soon, the archaeologist was about to arrive, and Ed and Kelly went to greet him. However, when Alara received the archaeologist's personal information, she sensed trouble and rushed to stop him from landing. But she was too late. The archaeologist was none other than Darulio, Kelly's former lover, who had been the cause of her infidelity. The sight of Darulio was like a lightning bolt to Ed, who immediately grew passive-aggressive. Darulio tried to change the subject to work and extended a handshake in an attempt to smooth things over. Ed barely contained his emotions and reluctantly instructed Alara to take Darulio to the lab. On their way to the lab, Darulio accidentally stepped on Yafit, who was undeterred since it didn't affect him as a gelatinous being. Yafit was carrying flowers and a guitar on his way to ask the doctor out for dinner. Unfortunately, the doctor wasn't interested, and Yafit left disappointed, although she did keep the flowers. Meanwhile, Kelly sought out Darulio to officially end things with him, but as they talked, old feelings began to resurface. In the meantime, both delegations arrived, but the engineer noticed that Kelly hadn't shown up to greet them, so Ed went to her quarters to find her. Unsurprisingly, when he opened the door, he was met with a shocking scene. Kelly and Darulio together again. Furious at the betrayal, Ed could barely contain his rage, but he knew he had to set aside his personal feelings to greet the delegations. Tensions were already high, with both delegations throwing verbal jabs at each other, and a fight was about to break out. Ed stepped in and diplomatically managed to calm them down, sending them back to their quarters for the time being. After dealing with the diplomatic crisis, the emotional drama resumed. Kelly confided in Alara, explaining how seeing Darulio again reignited her passion for him. She now believed he was her soulmate and true love. Meanwhile, Ed vented to Gordon, growing angrier by the minute. In a fit of frustration, he stormed off to confront Darulio and tell him to leave. But strangely, within just a few minutes, Ed's attitude completely changed. Not only did he invite Darulio for drinks in the mess hall, but he even sprayed on cologne for the occasion, leaving Gordon utterly baffled. The strange behavior wasn't limited to Ed and Kelly. Soon, even the doctor appeared, dressed up and heading to Yafit's quarters for a romantic evening. This, however, left the delegations feeling neglected, prompting them to head to the mess hall to find Alara and ask for updates. Just as Ed arrived for his rendezvous with Darulio, one of the delegates tried to ask when the results of the genetic testing would be ready, but Ed, now fixated on Darulio, brushed them off with vague answers before hurrying off to meet him. Kelly and Darulio had already begun their intimate moment, and when Ed found out, he confronted Kelly, sparking a jealous confrontation. Meanwhile, with no one in charge, Bortus was left to handle the delegates' questions, doing his best to stall for time with diplomatic niceties. As if things couldn't get worse, the doctor's 2 sons reported to Alara that the doctor had locked herself in her room for hours. Alarmed, Alara went to investigate and, upon opening the door, was horrified to find the doctor wrestling her muscles with Yafit. Shocked, she fled the scene in a panic. Shortly after, the doctor emerged fully dressed to speak with Alara, casually mentioning that she had fallen in love with Yafit and was planning to marry him. Alara was left utterly speechless by the revelation. Meanwhile, Bortis informed Alara that both delegations had lost patience and were preparing for war, leaving the situation in her hands. Alara quickly headed to the lab and kicked out Ed and Kelly, who were still caught up in their romantic entanglement with Derulio. She demanded an explanation from Derulio. Cornered, he admitted that his species experiences an annual mating cycle, during which his skin emits pheromones that attract mates. Anyone who comes into contact with his skin becomes uncontrollably infatuated with him. It turned out that when Ed and Kelly shook hands with Derulio, they were inadvertently exposed to the pheromones. Additionally, Derulio accidentally stepped on Yafit, and the doctor must have smelled the flowers Yafit had brought her, also becoming affected. Worse yet, the engineer discovered that there was no antidote, and the effects would only fade over time. However, due to the pheromones' influence, Ed had no interest in mediating the conflict and wanted nothing more than to return to Derulio. Eventually, Ed and Derulio ended up fencing for fun, while Kelly was left alone, heartbroken. At this point, both delegations had called in their warships, and a full-scale battle was imminent. In a surprising twist, it was Derulio who stepped up, working with Alara to cleverly use the pheromones to make the two ambassadors fall in love with each other. The ambassadors then ordered their warships to retreat, ending the conflict with an absurdly peaceful resolution. Sometime later, the effects of Derulio's pheromones wore off, and Ed, now back to his senses, expressed concern that once the ambassadors' pheromones faded, the conflict would reignite. However, Derulio had one last trick up his sleeve. He revealed that the artifact contained DNA from both races, proving they shared a common ancestor. This allowed both sides to set aside their differences. Having completed his mission, Derulio prepared to leave the Orville. Before his departure, Kelly asked him if he was in his mating cycle when she had cheated on Ed. Derulio hesitated and responded with a vague answer. A few days later, the Orville encountered an ion storm, and the control room took severe damage. One crew member was trapped under a fallen bulkhead, gravely injured. Several crew members tried to help, but none of them could move the heavy bulkhead. The chief called for Alara. She rushed to the scene, but just as she arrived, an explosion occurred. The sight of the flames stunned Alara, freezing her in place until the chief's shouts brought her back to reality. Unfortunately, her hesitation cost precious time, and another piece of the bulkhead fell, killing the crew member beneath it. Once the crisis was resolved, Ed held a memorial service for the fallen crew member, and the entire team was consumed by grief, especially Alara, who was overwhelmed with guilt. To vent her frustration, she went into the environmental simulator and began furiously punching a sandbag, eventually shattering it with a single blow. Kelly and the doctor, having noticed her unusual behavior, tried to comfort her, but Alara couldn't forgive herself. Deep in thought, she eventually decided to resign, telling Ed that she no longer felt capable of serving on the Orville. Ed refused to accept her resignation and encouraged her to confront the root of her fear of fire. Alara spoke with her parents and learned the truth. When she was just 8 months old, her mother had fallen asleep holding her on the couch one night. A fire broke out in the kitchen and spread to the living room. Alara's screams woke her mother just in time for them to escape. Despite learning the cause of her trauma, Alara remained troubled. As she walked down the hallway, she suddenly spotted a terrifying clown running toward her. Startled, she froze, but when she looked again, the clown had vanished. She quickly reported the incident to Ed. The crew reviewed the security footage, confirming that the clown was real. Ed ordered the team to split up and search the ship. Alara and Bortis went to the storage area, where the clown reappeared. The clown startled Alara, seeming to teleport erratically. After several tense moments, Alara seized her chance and shot the clown, killing it. Following the incident, the crew gathered to discuss the situation. Ed decided to activate a yellow alert, instructing everyone to stay on high alert. After the meeting, everyone headed back to their quarters to rest, but when Kelly entered her room, she suddenly stepped into what appeared to be a bottomless pit, nearly falling before Alara pulled her back to safety. The bizarre incident led the crew to suspect that a brain virus might be affecting them, so they immediately sought help from the doctor, who suggested performing brain scans on everyone. It wasn't long before it was Alara's turn to be scanned. As she lay on the examination table, the doctor activated a machine that restrained her, claiming it was to ensure more accurate results. The doctor then left to fetch some tools. Alara, sensing something was off, called in the nurse to help untie her. When the doctor returned, she shockingly killed the nurse and prepared to cut Alara open. In a desperate burst of strength, Alara broke free from the restraints and threw the doctor aside. The doctor was quickly apprehended and interrogated, but she had descended into madness, speaking incoherently. This left the crew even more confused, forcing them to hold another discussion. Kelly proposed the theory that the ion storm had not only damaged the ship, but also somehow broken the barrier between reality and some unknown world. As the crew was talking, a spider suddenly appeared on the table. Even worse, the room quickly filled with a swarm of spiders, sending everyone scrambling to leave. They drew their weapons, ready to eliminate the threat. But to their shock, the spiders vanished just as quickly as they had appeared. Realizing they couldn't waste any more time, Ed ordered the ship to return to the ion storm. Alara and Gordon headed back to the bridge, but when they got into the elevator, a giant spider appeared. They fired several rounds, but it had no effect on the creature. Panicked, they ran, but the spider was faster. It caught up to them and swallowed Gordon whole in one bite. Alara, horrified by what she had just witnessed, had to stop and compose herself. After calming down, Alara returned to the bridge, only to find it completely empty. She tried to contact the rest of the crew over the ship's intercom, but no one responded. By now, the ship had re-entered the ion storm, and Alara had no choice but to head to the control room to check on the situation. Thankfully, the engineer was there, and Alara, feeling like she had found a lifeline, waited anxiously for him to figure out what was going on. As they waited, Alara informed him that Gordon was dead. The engineer casually mentioned that they should be cautious of alien creatures. Alara immediately sensed something was wrong. She had never said that Gordon was killed by a spider. When she pressed him for an explanation, the engineer grew evasive. It was then that Alara realized the truth. The engineer was behind everything. They fought fiercely, and as the struggle continued, the engineer revealed its true form. Alara swiftly overpowered the creature and took it down. She then bolted to the shuttle bay, planning to escape the Orville. But just as she prepared to leave, the creature returned and shot at the hazardous materials, causing a massive explosion. Flames erupted around her. This time, instead of freezing, Alara faced her fear of fire head-on and piloted the shuttle to safety, successfully escaping the Orville. At that moment, Alara snapped back to reality. It turned out that after learning the truth from her parents, she had asked the engineer to create a simulation to help her overcome her fear of fire. Everything she had experienced since seeing the clown, the spiders, the terrifying scenes, had all been part of a virtual reality test. The creatures and events, including the clown and the spiders, had been drawn from the personal fears of the other crew members. To ensure the test's effectiveness, Alara had even asked the doctor to perform a short-term memory wipe so she wouldn't know it was a simulation. She had also taken the extreme step of activating a special override code without permission, risking a court-martial to prevent Ed from stopping the simulation prematurely. In the end, Alara successfully faced each crisis and conquered her fears. Now she could finally rest easy, having earned herself a well-deserved sleep. The scene shifts to the crew of the Orville throwing a grand farewell party for the chief of engineering, who was about to be promoted. Amid the festivities, Gordon and John, known for their pranks, were up to their usual mischief. This time, they had placed a piece of Yafit's body into the buffet, waiting for him to discover it. Both of them thought Yafit hadn't noticed, but in reality he was well aware of their trick and went straight to the doctor to report the situation. Meanwhile, Bortus, who could eat anything, also approached the doctor, complaining of indigestion. Upon investigation, the doctor discovered that Bortus had unknowingly ingested part of Yafit. After some discussion, Yafit quickly realized that Gordon and John were behind the prank and retrieved the piece of his body from Bortus. Not long after, Kelly confronted Gordon and John, prepared to issue them a formal reprimand. Knowing they were at fault, the two had no objections. Afterward, Kelly pulled up John's file and stumbled upon something surprising. She immediately went to Ed with the news. According to the aptitude assessments, John was the most intelligent crew member on the Orville, aside from the engineer. This gave Kelly a bold idea, to appoint John as the new chief of engineering. Ed was initially taken aback, as John hadn't shown any leadership abilities. As they discussed the matter, the ship was suddenly struck by a strong impact, prompting Ed and Kelly to rush to the bridge. After investigating, the crew discovered that the ship had collided with an unknown space object. The good news was that no one was hurt, but the bad news was that the engine was severely damaged. Ed ordered the engineer to assess the situation, and Kelly insisted that John assist him. Confused but unable to refuse, John complied. During their inspection, nothing seemed out of the ordinary except for a mysterious plant that had withered and died for no apparent reason. The crew gathered to discuss the issue, but no one had any answers, so they temporarily adjourned. Afterward, Kelly continued her conversation with Ed, eventually persuading him to let John take over as chief of engineering. However, in her excitement, Kelly accidentally revealed that she had once advocated for Ed's promotion to captain. Shocked, Ed couldn't believe that his promotion had been influenced by Kelly's intervention. He struggled to accept this revelation and contacted the fleet commander, who reluctantly confirmed it, but assured Ed that he had since proven himself more than capable of the position. Still, Ed was left questioning his own merit. Meanwhile, Kelly summoned John and strongly urged him to take on the role of chief engineer. John, who preferred to coast through life, tried to resist, stating he was content just getting by. But Kelly insisted, leaving him no choice but to accept. At the same time, Bortus detected a smuggler ship approaching the mysterious object. Ed tried to warn the ship's captain, but his warnings were ignored. The crew could only watch as the smuggler ship collided with the object. Ed led a team to investigate the wreckage, finding the captain dead on the spot. In the cargo hold, they discovered dozens of Krill rifles, which meant that Krill warships would soon arrive to reclaim them. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Ed knew they had to repair the engines and leave as soon as possible. However, back on the Orville, Ed encountered Yafit, who was frustrated. As one of the senior engineers, Yafit felt he should have been appointed as the new chief, not John. Yafit's discontent only added to John's difficulties. Lacking leadership skills, John tried to build camaraderie with his team, but only made things awkward. Defeated, he sent everyone back to their stations. Despite this, John's intelligence came through, and working alongside the engineer, he quickly uncovered the truth about the mysterious object. It was actually a gateway to a two-dimensional space. The smuggler ship had passed through the gateway and entered the two-dimensional world, where proteins, being three-dimensional structures, lost their functionality, leading to the instant death of the ship's captain and the withering of the plant. Meanwhile, the Krill warships were closing in on the Orville. With the engines still not fully repaired, John proposed creating a quantum bubble that could protect the ship in the two-dimensional space, allowing them to hide there. With no other options, Ed agreed to the plan. Thanks to the crew's combined efforts, the Krill warships lost track of the Orville. Once inside the two-dimensional space, the crew was amazed by the sight, as it marked the first time the Union had encountered a two-dimensional civilization. Ed decided to stay for a while to scan the area and gather data while waiting for the Krill to leave. Unfortunately, the tranquility didn't last. The ship suddenly experienced a violent collision, knocking everyone to the ground. When the shaking subsided, the crew found themselves with nosebleeds, leaving them to wonder what had just happened. Things took a turn for the worse when John discovered that the entrance to the two-dimensional space had closed, trapping the crew inside. The team quickly gathered to discuss their options. The engineer pointed out that the two-dimensional space was slowly pulling the Orville further into it, but there was an exit nearby. To escape, they would need to send out a shuttle and pull the Orville through the exit before the quantum bubble protecting the ship burst. Ed volunteered to pilot the shuttle himself. John and the engineer set to work preparing a small bubble for the shuttle. During this time, John overheard some of his team members complaining about Yafit and his performance. As a leader, John quickly stepped in and defended Yafit, demanding that everyone treat their colleagues with respect, showing that John was finally growing into his leadership role. Ed and John worked together to navigate the shuttle, towing the Orville toward the exit. After some intense maneuvers, the crew narrowly escaped, pulling themselves back into three-dimensional space just in time. After this harrowing ordeal, John successfully proved himself worthy of the chief engineer position, earning the respect of his team. As for Ed, he finally overcame his self-doubt and realized that Kelly had been supporting him all along, rekindling their relationship. A few days later, Ed found himself with some free time and wanted to grab a drink. Unfortunately, Gordon was already preparing for bed, and John had other plans, leaving Bortus, who had just put his children to bed, as the only one available. The three sat down to enjoy some traditional Mocklin liquor. Bortus and his partner invited Ed to join them in a Mocklin game, but unfamiliar with the rules, Ed ended up getting his hand pierced in the process. Afterward, Ed decided to set his pride aside and video call Kelly, inviting her to the mess hall for a drink. Kelly gladly accepted, and the two shared a heartfelt conversation. By the end of the night, the old flames had rekindled, and the pair ended up getting so drunk that they were still slightly disoriented when they reported for duty the next morning. Afterward, the Orville encountered a previously unknown planet. As was customary, the crew prepared to take a shuttle down to investigate. However, before they reached the planet, the shuttle suddenly entered its atmosphere. Another planet had mysteriously appeared out of nowhere in space. Kelly's team made an emergency landing, and fortunately, the shuttle only needed minor repairs. With some time to spare, Kelly decided to take a walk to explore the planet's surroundings. She discovered that the civilization was still in the Bronze Age. The engineer reminded her to avoid interacting with the locals to prevent cultural contamination. Kelly agreed, but while wandering, accidentally encountered two young girls. Startled, they ran away and one of them fell to the ground. Kelly rushed over to help, using soothing words and even pulling out a medical device to heal the girl's injury. However, this kind act was witnessed by villagers. Realizing she had violated the Union's non-interference directive, Kelly fled the scene and returned to the Orville. She and Ed reported the mysterious planet to Union leadership, who instructed them to stay and observe the planet further. However, Ed, covering for Kelly, chose not to report her interaction with the native children. When they returned to the bridge, a new complication arose. The planet had mysteriously disappeared before their eyes. The engineer, drawing on his extensive experience, suggested that the planet's orbit might be oscillating between two universes, appearing in one and then the other periodically. According to his calculations, the planet would reappear in their universe in 11 days. With some unexpected downtime, Ed and Kelly decided to take advantage of the situation and spent the time reconnecting, enjoying some well-deserved time together. 11 days later, the planet reappeared, but the engineer made a startling discovery. The population and number of buildings had drastically increased. Ed immediately led a team down to investigate, and to their surprise, the planet had advanced to a 14th century level of civilization in just 11 days. The engineer explained that time in the alternate universe where the planet had been was accelerated, meaning that 700 years had passed since Kelly's last visit. Fascinated by this rapid evolution, Ed decided to lead the crew into the city for closer observation. To blend in with the locals, the crew had to borrow clothing from nearby residents. However, they were caught in the act by one of the villagers. Surprisingly, the villager wasn't frightened. Instead, she approached Kelly while holding her child and begged for a blessing. Kelly hesitated but eventually gave a symbolic blessing. The villager was so moved that she broke down in tears, thanking Kelly profusely. Ed couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. On their way, the crew stumbled upon several villagers who had been hanged. A passing native explained that these people were executed for not believing in Kelly's teachings. It became clear that Kelly's previous actions had drastically influenced the planet. When the crew arrived in the city, they were shocked to find that the inhabitants had made Kelly their sole deity. Children were calmed at the mention of her name, judges invoked her name to sentence criminals, and the villagers had even erected statues in her honor. At this point, Ed could no longer cover for Kelly and was forced to report the situation to the Union leadership. Thankfully, he wasn't dismissed, but was given a formal reprimand. Still, the responsibility of fixing the situation on the planet fell on Ed's shoulders. After much deliberation, Ed decided to return to the planet with Kelly. The crew stormed the palace of the High Priest, where Kelly revealed her true identity, causing the terrified natives to fall to their knees. The High Priest, in awe of what he believed to be the divine presence of Kelly, recalled the legend of how she healed the young girl years ago with her holy touch. Seizing the opportunity, Kelly demonstrated her humanity by cutting her own hand and healing it with a medical device, even letting the High Priest try it for himself. She then explained the planet's time distortion and stressed that she was no god, just an ordinary person. After much persuasion, the High Priest finally accepted the truth. With their mission accomplished, the crew returned to the Orville. However, after they left, the High Priest planned to reveal the truth to the public. His assistant, fearing the chaos this might cause, murdered him. When the planet reappeared again, the crew discovered that despite the civilization advancing to the 21st century, Kelly still wielded immense influence. Opponents of the faith had grown increasingly hostile, even launching an attack on Kelly's temple. The crew convened to discuss how to address the situation. Kelly, feeling responsible, offered to stay on the planet and help guide the locals toward technological advancement, but Ed refused to let her spend the rest of her life there. At that moment, the engineer volunteered, explaining that his lifespan stretched over millions of years and 700 years would pass in the blink of an eye for him. Ed recognized that this was their best solution. Soon, Gordon transported the engineer to the planet, and the crew waited for the next cycle. Many years later, the planet reappeared. By now, the locals' technology had far surpassed that of the Orville. They sent a spacecraft to greet the crew, and after receiving permission to board, 2 representatives beamed aboard with the engineer. The crew, naturally curious about the engineer's time on the planet, was taken aback by his response. He had done nothing. The representatives explained that while the engineer's arrival initially caused a stir, the population quickly grew accustomed to his presence, and the planet continued to develop without much interference. Now, in the alternate universe, the inhabitants' ships spanned the galaxy. Their perception of Kelly had also evolved. She was no longer revered as a deity, but recognized as an ordinary human from the Union fleet. The representatives reassured Kelly that the people had moved beyond their previous misconceptions, freeing her from the guilt she had carried. They explained that religious worship is a natural part of any civilization's history. Even without Kelly's influence, other deities would have emerged. As long as curiosity and rationality drive a society, it will eventually progress to the next stage of development. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.